Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate everyone's time. I want to welcome Commissioner Steinbrook for being here. Thank you for joining us as well. We're really excited to share this program with you. My name is Bukta Qaisar, and I'm the Director of Office of Equity at the Port of Seattle. And we, over the last few weeks, as King County's released the number of people who've tested positive and have passed as a result of COVID, as they've started tracking that data by race, we know that all communities of color have been deeply impacted. We acknowledge the tremendous loss in communities of color and all other communities. And in honor of API Awareness Month, the Port of Seattle has passed a proclamation against racism, that the racism that the API communities have been targeted and experienced over the last few months, and the webinar today for us to keep on shining a light on this issue. And I'm going to turn, just a couple of other, housekeeping items are for everyone to please turn off your camera and be sure to mute yourself. There are 265 people now on this call, and we want to make sure to hear each other easily, to hear the speakers easily, so please mute yourself. Type your questions in the chat function, and I will read them when the right time comes. And I will turn it over to Commissioner Cho. And thank you for your tremendous leadership, Commissioner Cho. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to work with you.
Well, no, thank you so much, Bukta, for all your work. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really still shocked right now that we have so many people on the call, which is a good thing. And I love that, we have, I believe, mostly people from within the port, and a good number of people from outside the port as well. So we have a good mix here today. For those of you who don't know who I am Sam Cho, the newest member of the Port Commission. I normally don't have this facial hair, so you might not recognize me. So I apologize in advance for my appearance. But part of the reason I wanted to do this was not just because it's API Heritage Month, but because the port and our communities have been affected by COVID-19 in so many different ways, from our friends and families losing their jobs, to our city pretty much being shut down, and especially for those of you who work here at the Port of Seattle, we've seen just about every business line take a pretty big hit in terms of activity and revenue. And so I've said this so many times that I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but we're in truly uncertain times, uncharted territory. If there's anything that I've learned in the first 5 months of being a commissioner and dealing with a global pandemic, is that there's really no playbook for now. And so first, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to the employees of the Port of Seattle who have really stuck with us and have fully executed their roles, capacities. I just want everyone to know that you are all valued here in this organization, that everyone plays their parts, and we're going to get through this together. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone back at 69 or SeaTac or wherever it is that you all are stationed. I'm really excited by today. We are joined by 3 amazing leaders in the AAPI community. But before I introduce them, I really want to real quickly talk about the proclamation that was passed last Tuesday. As you or many of you know, this, I believe, is the first of its kind, a proclamation that in essence condemns any form of racism towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in association with the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to kind of set the scene for this conversation, we all know that, people suspect that this virus started in China, and as a result, we saw huge, quite frankly, just discrimination and racism towards our community starting in January. And so that's why I felt the need for us as a port to stand up and really take a stance on this. And it's mainly because of our role here in this region. As you all know, we are the gateway to the Pacific Northwest. And as such, we should maintain a welcoming gateway. And those who know me or have heard my story know that my parents immigrated to this country through the Port of Seattle many, many years ago. And I think that the Port of Seattle should always remain a welcoming place, and this region should always be a place of welcome for people of color, immigrants, and refugees. And so that's why I thought this was so important. It happens that today's panelists are also individuals who spoke at the commission meeting in favor of the project. So I'll just go quickly down the line, introduce their name and where they're from, and then I'll let them introduce themselves and the work they do. First, we have Michael Byun, who is the Executive Director of the Asian Counseling Referral Service down in Seattle. A tremendous leader in our community, does a lot for immigrants and refugees. And then we have Toshiko Hasegawa, the Executive Director of the Washington State Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. This is a gubernatorial cabinet-level position, quite frankly, and she has been doing an extremely great job. I have to give a shout-out to the commission because I actually also serve on the Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. So I'm kind of like commission squared, as people say, because I serve on two commissions. So it's great to have you, Toshiko. And then lastly, but certainly not least, Samith Mel, a huge leader in our community on the grassroots end. He is with Equity in Education. He works in Equity in Education. He's currently a project director for Partners in Change. And so real quick, if each of you in that order could just quickly, starting with Michael, go over, what your organization does and what your primary function is.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And again, Michael Byun with Asian Counseling and Referral Service. A big thank you to Sam Cho, Commissioner Sam Cho, along with Commissioner Steinberg, who's on the call, and a big thank you to Bukta as well for her leadership in this effort with celebration of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So Asian Counseling and Referral Service, for many of you who may know or those who don't know, we're one of the oldest comprehensive health and social service organization in the community that have been rooted in social justice work. And the work we do hand in hand with community to address issues around language and cultural barriers at a time like this is really incredibly important. And we're just really fortunate to be part of the community, supported by community, as we all work together to address the challenges that individuals and families have in our community during this COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm looking forward to sharing more from my perspective about what we've been doing and what we've been seeing in the community. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Toshiko?
Hey, everybody. This is Toshiko Hasegawa. I'm the Executive Director of what we just simply refer to as CAPA. And CAPA is a state agency that advises the governor, but also the state legislature and all the other agencies on the issues impacting Asian Pacific Americans. Just to give you a snapshot of who our community is, we come from over 40 different countries across Asia and the Pacific Islands. We speak over 100 languages and 1,000 dialects. We are present in every single county throughout Washington State. We're the second largest and the fastest growing minority population. So obviously it's a steep charge, and especially when you're trying to figure out what meaningful representation and service looks like to such a vastly geographic and culturally diverse constituency. To help us do our job, as Commissioner Cho mentioned, we work collaboratively with 12 gubernatorial appointees. They represent that geographic diversity, but also some of that cultural diversity. And what they are is they're really trusted messengers that help us be able to reach people so that not only can we do some story finding and kind of understand realistically what the experience is and what the priorities are of the people, but also so that we can make sure that we're connecting them meaningfully with opportunities and services that are offered by the state. And we really focus on a few different areas. One of them is economic development, and we're really proud to partner on an ongoing basis with the Port of Seattle. Most recently, some of you might have heard of an opportunity fair, opportunity fair that we host in conjunction with the other ethnic commissions right there at the port. So thank you for your hospitality. We also look at education, health and human services, Census 2020, civil rights, and immigration. So that's just a really quick synopsis of a little bit of what we do and who we do it for.
Awesome. Thank you, Toshiko. And then lastly, but certainly not least, Samuth, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? You might need to unmute yourself first. Did we lose Samuth?
I don't know.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you again, Commissioner Cho, Bukta, and everyone else. Thank you for having me on. My name is Sumit Mel. I work with Equity and Education Coalition, Project Director for Partners in Change, the partnership for short. So the partnership is made up of small and micro organizations that are serving undocumented communities, migrant farm workers, the incarcerated, detained, houseless, disabled, refugee, immigrant, multilingual, LGBTQ, Native, and low-income communities of color. We're predominantly made up from diverse ethnic groups and multiracial groups across King County and Washington State, with more than 24 zip codes. We do work on the ground level, and we have 5 committees right now. We have our first committee, Power for Communities of Color Advocacy Committee. We have a committee to address our front lines and immediate needs. We have a committee for network and communications, and a systems and reporting anti-hate and bias committee, and also inclusive communities committee. We've been really been working with a lot of our partners on the ground level who's been pushing out the immediate needs and building a lot of community-based building at the grassroots level. So we're really happy to be on this phone call with you all to share what else we've been doing and to envision a better future that's rooted in racial and social justice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Samuth. We have a great panel here today. Just as a reminder to folks who are tuning in, if you have a question, you can ask it in the chat. And for the last time, just housekeeping, if you're not speaking, please make sure you're muted. I wanted to open this up by kind of providing everyone with some context with, everyone talks about, the API community has been affected, we've been affected, but I really want to take this time to really talk about what that means and how our community has been affected and since when. I think a lot of people don't realize that we were the first hit. And when I say the first hit, we don't mean like the first one to hit as everyone was hit, but we were hit way before anyone else was hit. So I'll just open it up if one of you guys want to go ahead and just talk about when this started for us as a community and what we saw so far.
Yeah, I can, if folks are okay, I'll go ahead and start. I think that, so when we heard the first cases in Wuhan, China, and then right even before the first cases here in the U.S., which was here in Washington State, we saw immediately Asian-run businesses across the region seeing a dramatic reduction in business, anywhere from in the area of 20 to 70%. And part of that is the fact that the broader community was connecting the COVID-19 to Asian Americans, and there were unfounded fear that patroning a Asian business might potentially put them at higher risk. So that was already a major challenge for us in terms of the stigma associated. And one of the things that we're seeing even now and as the pandemic progresses is the fact that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have a double whammy, especially our small businesses that are run by Asian Pacific Islanders. Not only are businesses down because of the strict guidance that public health and the governor's office has put together to keep us safe and has prevented folks to go out and patron businesses, but the fact that there's still discrimination, hate crime, and harassment among towards our communities, which is a double whammy for businesses, and they're struggling even more than many others are. And so this is something that we're deeply concerned about, and this is one example of how the pandemic has impacted our communities.
Yeah, I remember, Toshiko, if you remember, you and I, broke bread with Mayor Durkin over in International District. I think it was like early February, before it really became a huge thing. And the community really rallied around the International District in many ways, but it's still tough.
Right, and that's just one angle, I think, of the impact upon the APA community. So as many of us are committed to learning and understanding, there are huge equity gaps.
I think everyone got muted all of a sudden. Toshka, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Test. So
There you go.
there are pre-existing equity gaps that impact people of color, poor people, immigrants, refugees. What we're really seeing here is across the board, those equity gaps are deepening. The problems that have always faced them across the board are being exacerbated. So economic development, right, the struggle for small businesses is being exacerbated because prejudice, stigma, racism, bias incidents, and hate crimes have always existed against APIs. But what we're seeing is a resurgence in some of those attitudes and a deepening of some of those impacts. So we're also seeing that in education, right? We're seeing that in people's inaccessibility to be able to qualify for some of the stimulus packages that are being offered through the CARES Act or from the state of Washington based upon their immigration status. Anybody without a social security number might not qualify. And even if they do, they're late to leave the start line because they missed their cue because it's not translated or it's not culturally accessible to them in a very specific way, or they need assistance to be able to qualify. So they're not getting a fair bite at the apple. And so not only are people's issues compounding, but the environment within which they're living in becomes even more intimidating. They live with greater fear, and that uncertainty is really a tremendous pressure that folks have to live with.
Yeah, I think you touched upon something that's really important and that I've been having to reflect on for the past few months is that I think COVID-19 has made, racism towards Asian Americans more pronounced, but it's not new. That this has been around, and perhaps this pandemic has unearthed and or exacerbated what has always existed. But if one of you guys just talk about the history of APIs and the examples of kind of the unfair the laws and practices that the government has done in the past towards the APIs.
Hey Sam, Commissioner Cho, can I also kind of add on to what Toshiko was talking about real quick?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sure. No worries. I was just going to say, like what Toshiko mentioned around language access has been a huge gap and an issue in our community, because we know that a lot of our elders, have been isolated before, and now like they're even more isolated, right? And we're talking about senior citizens from war-torn countries like from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia that I'm specifically talking to. I know there are other folks that are impacted too, but they're hyper isolated in these times, and there's a lot of confusion around information and how best to navigate this crisis. And also those businesses that are being hit hard. I mean, even before the pandemic hit, three Khmer businesses in the region, the only 3 have closed out and 1 came back. But this issue is exacerbating even further, where we know that some of our shops in White Center had closed for like 2 weeks or so, which cuts a lot of, of their business. And so PPEs and hand sanitizers, I mean, where can people go get that? If you're talking about relief funds from, the PPP from the federal government, the last time that came down, folks in CTAC weren't even able to access the application because it's not in language and they don't have a liaison to walk them through it. So it's unfair. It's really unjust to see the fact that a lot of these resources that are supposed to be for our communities don't get to have are not accessible at all for our community members to be able to access. So I just wanted to talk about that, and also really looking at like micro nonprofit organizations led by communities of color that also need support during our times right now, and they're not really getting the resources that they need to make sure that they continue the work in a meaningful way, because they serve our region very well.
So, Commissioner, if I could answer your question too, I just want to share a little bit of what we saw from the perspective of CAPA in terms of a timeline very succinctly. So as Executive Director Bien mentioned, at first it was a matter of folks deciding not to patronize Asian-owned businesses because they're prejudiced that it might be unclean or unsanitary, right? And we saw folks, small acts of bias where a child was denied a sample at Costco. Then it turned into blatant acts of systemic discrimination. Entire groups of Chinese students removed from a dorm into coma and forced to sleep somewhere else even though none of them had traveled. Chinese students at a public school in Bellevue being unilaterally removed from class to be tested for COVID even though nobody in their family had traveled, right? These were oversteps of what the Department of Health's recommendations were, and those were things that needed to be talked about. Let's educate our administrators, let's educate our superintendents about what policies and what abundance of caution looks like when we're trying to screen for COVID-19. Mm-hmm. But I think the place where I pinpoint a change in attitude was the President of the United States referred to it publicly as the Wuhan virus, as the Chinese virus, as the Kung flu. And that was not on accident, right? That is actually very intentional. It is a way to cast blame and otherize an entire group of people when, in fact, the World Health Organization explicitly warns against connecting place of origin or race with disease, cognizant of the bigotry that it could incite. And indeed, what we ended up seeing after that were overt acts of hate. So people vandalizing businesses in CID, in Yakima, in Whitman County, postings on people's doors that said things like, take your Chinese virus back to Wuhan. And then very, very disconcertingly, some shockingly violent physical attacks. In particular, that comes to mind is one against an Asian man outside of a QFC in North Seattle. And that's incited violence. That's emboldened racism, right? The attitude may have always been there, but it's being incited. And the reason why this ties into the question that you asked about our history is because this isn't the first time we've seen this in a playbook. And it's important to keep that in mind because it helps us know what might come next for our people now, because these acts, these prejudicial attitudes have historically been precursors to acts of systemic oppression. And I'm referring to Chinese peril or yellow peril leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, Japanese incarceration in 1942. At the port, the people of the port will readily recall the Muslim ban in 2017. And all of those, you know, are direct results. All of those things were legal. And so we need to be really cognizant and take this very seriously because we're seeing it from the highest office of the land where people are inciting that otherism that makes it normal to oppress people and keep them to the side, which is why what we need is leadership on every level of government with a constituency that will listen to denounce hate and denounce those hurtful terms, even if it's in jest. That's why it's not a playing factor, and that's why I was glad to provide public testimony for the action of the port last week.
And I'd like to add to Toshiko's comments. I think she had referenced the Chinese Exclusion Act and then the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. 100 years right after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1982, we saw the murder of Vincent Chen in the Midwest. This was based on the fact that around that time in our country, the automobile sector was in competition with Japan and their automobile sector. And people who in the Midwest figured that they were out of their jobs and wanted to target and scapegoat someone, had just happened to have Vincent Chin in that bar that night and then decided to target him. This is part of our history. It is part of what we need to acknowledge as an important element of us to better understand why this current anti-Asian hate crimes is unacceptable. And we need to rise above that as a community. Not only AAPIs, but the entire community as a whole, to recognize that we don't want to repeat this again.
Wow, there's so much there to unpack. Toshiko, you touched upon something that's really important, and that this could be a precursor to something in the future. In fact, I believe that we've already seen something. Michael, as you know, the president has issued a freeze on issuing visas, or basically just a freeze on immigration for, is it 90 days or for several months now. I know that ACRS does a lot on counseling on this front. I'm curious to get your on-the-ground take on how this has impacted our community or just communities of color in general when it comes to immigrants who might be applying for visas and or their citizenship.
So since this administration came into office, we have seen time and time again efforts at systematically eroding our immigration system that has been such an important part of who we are as Americans. And we saw early actions by the administration on substantially reducing the refugee resettlement here to the U.S., and most recently with the Muslim ban, which unfortunately was upheld. So what we're concerned about is that this creates an environment of fear, even when there's already a reduction in the number of folks who are applying for citizenship. The fear further exacerbates and makes people less likely to want to participate, less likely want to apply for citizenship. And that's what we're seeing as well. And part of the work that our communities have to do with other community-based organizations is really educate our communities about their rights, what's available to them, and then to also encourage them, if they are eligible to apply for citizenship, to be naturalized so that they can be an active part of this dialogue in our community.
Yeah, and I just want to give a real quick shout out to any port staff who have worked in conjunction with One America on the citizenship clinics that we hold at SeaTac Airport and at Pier 69. We've partnered with some local organizations to hold these citizenship clinics where people can come in and ask questions about applying for citizenship. It's 100% volunteer based. It's a really good program. If you have any friends or family who need help with this, it's a really good place to start. Samith, I want to turn to you real quick and ask you a question that I think you are uniquely qualified to answer with your grassroots experience in education. Toshko mentioned there's an equity issue here. And given the COVID-19 pandemic and the basically the switch to online schooling and or virtual schooling, what kind of equity issues are you seeing? I have friends in the Seattle school district who have said that some kids don't have fast enough internet, don't have good enough laptop. They basically switched completely overhauled their grading system. So I'm kind of curious to hear how this pandemic has affected communities of color on education.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner Cho. So EEC has been working to have conversations with OSPI, Chris Reichdahl, and the governor's office to look at how we can address the digital equity issue, because we know that there's a lot of students from low income that have barriers to accessing Wi-Fi, internet, and those are real barriers, and also laptops. So we've been working with them to push out some laptops, but also to see what that looks like to offer digital equity like Wi-Fi, internet access. And I think also with King County Library System, we've been in conversation to see how that can be amplified as well. So those are all real, and just in terms of looking at where those gaps are and Wi-Fi deserts, it's going to be important to recognize that systematically we have to change some fundamental things in how people access these services. It should be a public service. So legislatively, I think there should be some type of universal broadband or Wi-Fi that happens for our state, because this is a huge issue. We see it exacerbated now. And I just wanted to also ask, and just wanted to check in, like when we're talking about these establishments, such as the Home Depot or Target and some other areas that you see these hate incidents coming up, I guess we all have to think about how we can keep these establishments accountable to the hate incidents and crimes that take place within their parameters, and what that looks like as well. So I just wanted to push that out there as messaging, because a lot of times you don't see like any type of messaging in front of their entrance to say that they don't condone these types of acts of intimidation or hate incidents and hate crimes. And I think it's a huge issue that we need to definitely address as more folks need to get out to markets and to shop for food and resources.
Great. Yeah, it's a huge issue, and I think that if Ryan Calkins, my colleague, was on the call, his ears would have perked if he heard about broadband, because I know that's something he wants the port to take on. Bukta, do we have any questions from the audience here we can ask? If we have a few good ones, we can go ahead and you can go ahead and read them off.
Yeah, we have one question about face masks. And I'll read the question. It's so apparent that there's an underlying anti-Asian bias in the widespread U.S. reluctant to wear face masks. Asian countries figured out decades ago that face coverings are the best way to prevent the spread of disease, but the science has been behind and catching up to that in Western countries. I think the question is about how many lives could have been saved if we had taken the Taiwan approach, wearing masks immediately, and our perceptions about mask wearing and your thoughts about that.
That's a good question. It's a really interesting one because I think that even here in our region, people who wore masks first were Asian Americans. And it's probably largely because we saw some of our, family members back. I mean, I know that when I still have family in Korea, and they've been wearing face masks since like December. Face masks are normal in those areas because of the pollution as well. It's not just because of the pandemic. And so it's pretty normal to wear face masks. But it was interesting because, they had sent me face masks earlier, and I would actually get weird looks from people for wearing them in public, as if I was signaling to people that I was sick, right? And people, wouldn't want to stand next to me or whatever, or give me weird looks. And so I'm curious to get you all's opinion or thoughts on this weird phenomenon where Asian Americans who were like the first to lead in wearing face masks were stigmatizing further, but then all of a sudden we're at this place where like everyone's being encouraged to wear face masks, ironically.
Michael, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is to look at, to the extent, and although there's still debate about the data around face masks, I think there's enough to say that wearing it can potentially provide additional safeguards for communities. Part of where I think the challenge right now is that face masks have been highly politicized, and I wish that we can continue to stay focused on the public health value of the face covering and the importance of helping to reduce transmission.
I think what I would add is that it didn't help that the CDC was late to actually formally recommend it, and there was a lot of information that said that it's not airborne or that there's no need because it's passed through microparticles. And so people, I think having formal direction for our government always helps, but I just also want to lift up that we're not past that, right? That stigma still exists within communities of color who are reluctant to put on face masks because they don't have clarity around the seriousness of this. That's a fact. People still are not getting the information that they need in a way that is idiomatically accessible, or two, that they're going to stigmatize against people who are wearing them and avoid them and be worried that that's going to happen to them. Some folks in their cultures cohabitate with multiple families under one roof. I mean, isolation is counterintuitive for so many of us, but I think in especially some tribal contexts, I use that to mean, micro communities who are at different stages of their acclimation into American culture and mainstream American life. The thought of being identified as having COVID and removed from your home and put into quarantine or isolation or in a hospital is absolutely terrifying. To not have contact with somebody for 2 weeks is absolutely terrifying. And so there's a lot of, I think, culturally specific outreach and educational campaigns that has to happen to different communities, including Pacific Islander communities who we know have disparate health outcomes when they do contract COVID-19. So we're not past it yet.
Can I ask
this is Samay.
Sorry, Samay. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Face mask really does. Sure, face mask. When you wear it, people are more alert around you. And I think I want to just do big shout outs to like the Khmer stores of Viet Hoa and Wajimai that I've been going to, and I see a lot of our communities having the non-medical face mask on. But when you go to like a Target or a Fred Meyer or Safeway, not everyone has these face masks on. So I just want to say big shout outs to our community that's starting to, or not even starting, they've been wearing non-medical face masks, and I still want to be able to hold the fact that, yeah, there are still informational gaps that needs to get out. So just wanted to issue that.
Yeah, I mean,
Commissioner Cho, there's a question for Sumit to speak a little bit more about Stop the Hate community campaign.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we've been working on is in conjunction, in partnership with the Attorney General's office and the Governor's office, is standing up this site, a community reporting site that Christopher Larson has created for organizations to use, and it's called stopthehate.community. So you can go to www.stopthehate.community, and you'll be able to report hate incidents and hate crimes. The really good thing about this is that it does provide heat maps and hotspot locations. So if there is a report happening like in the ID, a report happening in Bellevue or in Federal Way, you'll be able to see the reports in real time and notice all the hotspot areas. It's also community owned, so this data is for the community, owned by the community, and we're only going into partnership with institutions, but that particular data piece is held by the community. So we're hoping that folks are starting to utilize it, but the full press and announcement will be coming soon. So far, we've been having people who went on to report it, like Kurt Lynn, that reported the incident from the Home Depot, and a couple of other folks that have also reported. The good thing about this is the fact that even if you're a witness to a hate incident or a hate crime, you can also report that as a bystander or an observer that saw that incident take place.
Yeah.
Just to tag on what valuable information that Sumit had shared in this effort to create a repository around hate crime incidents, there's actually a national resource available through a partnership between Hollaback and Asian Americans for Advancing Justice. It's a bystander training that is available, and initially they started out with 1 or 2 online trainings, but because of the popularity and the demand for that, they're actually scheduling them on a weekly basis, and I'll put that information in the chat link here.
Great. Awesome. Kenny Lyles has a question, and I'll just, read it out. And he says that he was pretty disappointed in the SPD response with the Home Depot incident. And his question is, how can you make the SPD more accountable and responsive beyond just rhetoric? I think that's your forte, right, Toshiko?
I don't think that's anybody's forte. I share your disappointment, and also disappointment in the original response from management, right? I think that there's a lot of things at every step of that incident that are incredibly disappointing. What is true is that in the city of Seattle, Washington State, and nationwide, that hate crimes against Asian Americans is on the rise. And when that trend first became evident, Chief Best did make a public statement encouraging people to formally report, because that's the only way that a formal investigation could get launched. And as we know, we want people to be able to get justice that they deserve, right? We want offenders to be brought to justice. We want victims to be connected with support services. And unfortunately, when there's a failure of accountability via either arrest or pressing charges at any point throughout that criminal justice process, there's very little by the way of any sort of legal repercussions, and that's tremendously disappointing. I think what can be said, though, is that there are other ways for victims to receive support, and I'm also very interested in knowing that that the person who had that experience at Home Depot has a sense of community support, that the person has a sense of getting access to whatever sort, any victim would have access to medical or mental health support services that they do need. But when it comes to holding SPD specifically accountable, there are other avenues, and we know that there's police reform efforts, so that when a complaint directly or a case directly with SPD is allegedly mishandled, that it will be formally investigated through an independent body, including a civilian-led body, which is represented by the API community and some leaders. So I hope that this is not the end of that case, right? That there's actually institutional steps for somebody to be able to continue to seek the justice that they deserve.
This is Sumit. I want to add on to what Toshika was talking about. I really do think also those businesses and establishments also need to be held accountable alongside with the SPD or any type of police response. Also, a lot of our communities sometimes don't feel like they don't want to report it, but also, they don't trust the police enough to make that phone call. Incidents that happen at those establishments, they're telling you need to make a phone call to the police. Not everybody feels comfortable doing that. When pressed on their policies of inclusion and stuff, they just say it's diverse and inclusive, and they, making sure that they're, the folks who go to their stores are safe and stuff, but that doesn't mean anything, right? Because when I experienced it in Target, that's the stuff that they told me, and I'm like, wow, that doesn't make any sense. Why don't you have policies or messaging efforts at these establishments to make sure that those people who go there understand that you don't condone these types of acts of hate incidents? And I think we need to hold the SPD and police accountable, but we also need to make sure that these business establishments are held accountable as well, to make sure that it's safe for everybody, not just for some people.
Right, and there's also legal complexity in what the difference is between a bias incident, a hate crime, and discrimination, and all of those would legally get routed through different things. And when you're a victim, you're not worried about that. You just know that you've been wronged and that you need somebody to be able to respond, especially if you think that your physical safety has been endangered. So I think that there's a lot of complexity around that as well. That again, just the layman wouldn't differentiate, and they shouldn't have to. That's why also at the state there's a statewide hate crimes task force, and they're looking at what can be done to support people, including a statewide hotline that anybody could call and receive the support that they need.
Great. All right. So we have another question from Rob Lane. This is probably more a question for me, but I'm happy to answer it. It is, I am happy to see the Port and Commission response to prevent racism, but I'm wondering why there is a higher level of screening for international passengers coming into the airport, but not for domestic travel. That seems to support bias. And Rob, let me just say that I think you are absolutely right. There should be uniformity when it comes to screening passengers. This is probably not the answer you were expecting, but the truth is this is a question of jurisdiction and authority. So, and I think my port staff are going to freak out if I get into the about this issue. But basically, international travel is a CBP, the Customs Border Patrol jurisdiction, right? So if you come in from any country into SeaTac Airport, you go through customs and immigration. That's not a Port of Seattle function. We are really just providing them space to do that, right? And so CBP is the one that dictates we're going to take temperature check screenings on international passengers. And you're right. In fact, it almost shows the hand of the bias, because international travel was the first and, quite frankly, at this point, the only heightened or high level of screening. Now, as anyone, I think most people at the port already know, the commission and port staff have looked into screening domestically as well. The challenge, however, has also been, the question of who's going to carry out the screenings, right? In my mind, TSA is probably the most obvious, because everyone who goes through an airport needs to go through TSA screening. And so to tack on heightened screening makes a lot of sense in my mind. But in the absence of leadership on the federal level, the Port of Seattle has committed to doing this. Now, because we're not a public health agency, it's very difficult for us to figure out what the protocol is, what the legal ramifications are, because we've never done this before. Again, there's no playbook for this, and there's no precedence for this. We've never had to do this before on our own. And so we as a organization are reaching out to every authority we can possibly think of to figure out and get guidance on how to do this. It's definitely a challenging issue because we've been working on this for several weeks now, and I think we're almost there. But it's not intentional to support or to promote the perception of a bias. It's really just government bureaucracy and politics that gets in the way, which drives me insane. But that's the answer to that question. I hope that I answered that, and you should look forward to it. Actually, this reminds me, I should remind everyone on the call today that starting today, SeaTac Airport is requiring face coverings. I should note that it's intentionally called face coverings because they don't have to be like an N95 mask, for instance, like a bandana will do, right? So just cover your face at the airport. It doesn't have to be a face covering. It doesn't have to be a mask. Okay, just cover your face. Great. Let me pivot real quick. We've talked a lot about what's happened, but I'd like to take a quick minute to talk about what do we expect or hope to see in the coming recovery, economically, but also just for our community and healing. I think this pandemic has unearthed a lot of really troubling things in our society today. And I think that there's a lot of questions that need to be answered post-COVID-19. Something like, should healthcare be tied to employment? The question of broadband and is internet a commodity? But I'd like to get each of your takes on, what you hope to see in the coming recovery.
Yeah, so I'd like to first set the tone with what before I answer that question. And a couple things that I've recently discovered during some of these different convenings and calls that I've been participating on. One is recently on the King County's Pandemic Community Advisory Group meeting, there was some data that was shared around the rate of unemployment insurance claims. And the data that was sliced was focused on King County level. And what they found was not surprising, but it's something that I think is really important for us to continue to remember, and how this is disproportionately impacting particular communities. So the data in summary, we saw larger claims of unemployment on the south end of King County. And then we also saw disproportionate number of claims among communities of color, including indigenous people. And again, we have seen that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities, especially communities of color, immigrants, and refugees. The other important thing to share is that there's been some recent local media picking up on the fact that there's been concerns around crisis calls as it relates to people who are isolated. We've seen increases in domestic violence calls, but also we are seeing families that are isolated, especially among our communities of immigrants and who are disproportionately immigrants and refugees who are limited English proficient, at home and isolated, and especially our older adults vulnerable. I anticipate that there's going to be a major challenge in the long haul of the recovery, where we will as a community need to address mental health issues and how we can come out of this. Also concerns related to young people and their development, young children who are missing the opportunities to be in contact with their peers on the playground. I mean, that has long-term impacts. And so I think as a community, we should think about the mental health impacts.
Mm-hmm.
This is Sumit. On top of what everyone else has been talking about, this is really pushing forward a lot of the disparities and gaps in in the economic space, right? Like around economic justice. So we really need to really look at what that really means. Like the work that All In for Washington that's being led with BOCA around economic justice and looking at tax reform, because this is exacerbating these issues of who has access to certain areas of like relief. And I'm really talking about like also like the undocumented communities, the people who really pay into our system but don't receive those benefits. So that's going to be one thing that's big. And like, how do we really look at supporting guaranteed basic income for people in the state of Washington? And it really comes down to looking at how we can really continue to build relationship resiliency, right, in the face of these types of pandemic crisis, but also as we continue into the recovery phase and moving forward. So supporting frontline staff, we need to look at how we got to change fundamentally, like what it means to be a frontline staff and how do we support those frontline workers that are basically at the front lines every day now, but into the future, how are we going to be able to support them folks? So it really comes back to like healing and a lot of conversations and a lot of conversational infrastructure that needs to be built again.
Yeah, this is Toshiko, and I think, Sam, one of my fears is that as we approach upcoming budget sessions, that we're going to be taking a hard look at an austerity budget, or in other words, just slashing and saving and referring back to regressive taxing when we know that the people who have the least are being impacted the most already, and all of that is being exacerbated. So what I really want to see in the upcoming response to COVID-19 is some innovative funding sources. I want to see progressive taxation, and that could look like a capital gains tax, or that could look like an income tax, right? But it's no secret that Washington State has one of the most regressive tax systems, and that it's long time worked against working people. And I think that we really can't be serious about addressing any of our issues unless we're willing to actually do what needs to be done to make our taxing structure more progressive. I think another innovative funding source is also a state bank, which is something that's actually quite prudent to consider right now in this moment of history, so that the state has lending capacity for like low or no interest loans to small businesses or big businesses that are going to benefit from stuff like that, so that we have capital building power to be able to do things like rent relief or access for all to broadband or Wi-Fi. Those are specific issues that I want to see funded by the state legislature, right? But I can tell you from an agency perspective, we're already supposed to be thinking about what 5, 10, 15% savings at the agency level might look like. I think we'd be remiss not to see this not just as an opportunity, but as the moment, right? The responsibility to be able to seriously take on what we've been talking about for so long.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the legislature deals with the budget shortfalls. Mm-hmm. We only have a few more minutes here left, so I just want to give you all a real quick opportunity to share resources and or anything that your respective organizations are providing or have. Toshiko from the state level, Michael from ACRS, Samith from your organization as well. If we can just go around real quick and just shout out, resources and or initiatives or things that we should all be aware of or for communities.
Yeah. Well, thanks again to the port, and thank you, Sam, for facilitating today. From ACRS's perspective, this is our 30th anniversary for the Walk for Rice, which was founded 30 years ago. And part of what we're concerned about is that hunger is a major challenge during COVID-19, and it'd be really valuable and important that we continue, even though the walk is going to be virtual this year, to get community support to address hunger in our community. And they can find information at www.walkforrice.org.
Great.
Mine is that I think that what the world needs most of right now is fundamental human compassion and connection. And at a time where I think a lot of people feel this urgency to help, but their ability to do so is so limited from their couches, that I really encourage everybody to just do continued education here in APA Heritage Month. For the month of May, go online and do some active learning about some of the different cultures that we have and the histories of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders right here in Washington State. We have tremendous histories and civil rights wins and struggles, how far we've come, and the lessons that we've learned along the way. And I'd particularly like to flag for everybody also a PBS special on Rise Asian America. So give it a look. It's an awesome multi-part special that I think even your kids would be able to sit through. So that's just my ask, is enjoy your APA Heritage Month in a way that's meaningful.
I love it. Samit, do you have anything to share in terms of resources or what's going on?
Yeah, for sure. I think I really want to uplift like Solidarity Flowers. One of our partners, the Khmer community of Seattle County, has done this and raised within a week $29,000 to go to help support the Hmong farmers, as well as communities who were not met with the relief money. And so I wanted to say that, a lot of the stuff that's happening is us coming together, working through this together and healing together. And so we have a lot of needs that we're working on pushing out masks and also hand sanitizers and PPEs, but we're also working on advocacy items and making sure that we shift some policies as well as making sure we connect with our impacted communities. So folks are welcome to connect, Sameth, S-A-M-E-T-H, at EEC-WA.org. Thank you.
Sam, what was the first organization? Solidarity Flowers? What was that again?
Yeah, Solidarity Flowers for Mother's Day. That was with the Khmer community of Seattle King County in partnership with El Comite and the Hmong Association of Washington.
Great. Awesome. And Michael just shared the PBS documentary series online. I'm sure someone on Port staff can compile all these and send it out. So, we're up against 1 hour here. I did want to close out by just thanking each of you, the panelists today, for joining us and for providing your perspective, your insights, and your knowledge of the situation. I want to thank Peter Steinbrook, President of the Commission. I don't know if he's still on, but I know that he was on earlier. I sincerely support I sincerely support him as well, but appreciate the support that he's shown me since I've come onto the Commission. It's been a tremendous experience so far. And then lastly but not least, all the port staff who are on today, for all the work you're doing. Gupta, for all the work you're doing. You've been doing a tremendous job on equity, diversity, and inclusion here at the Port of Seattle, and I think that we will be an organization that is looking for other government agencies for as an example. But with that, Gupta, do you want to just close it out for us?
Yeah, thank you all for being here today. Thank you for all of our speakers. This has been an amazing program. I've gotten a lot of text with people who really appreciated your insights. About 285 people joined us for this conversation, and we taped this webinar, and we'll be sending a link through all of the Port's social media channels, and we'll make a list of the resources that were shared. Thank you all so much for the work that you do, and we stand together with you. Have a great afternoon.
Awesome. Have a great week, everybody. Please stay safe. Don't forget your masks, wash your hands, don't touch your face, all those things. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Sam. Bye-bye.